We all like good luck in our lives, but what do we think of it in our novels? I recently finished Nickleby by Charles Dickens, in which the title character experiences some really good fortune and in which the plot has some pretty wild coincidences. So I have some thoughts about luck in fiction. Welcome back to my channel. I created this space not just to share my thoughts on the books I happen to be reading, but also to share habits and approaches to reading that I have found really rewarding through the years. If you find these ways of reading helpful, I hope that they'll also enhance your own reading life. One of those approaches is something I call annual authors, just for fun, like Austen in August, when I reread a Jane Austen novel, or Dickens in December, when I read or reread a Dickens novel, obviously. And that made a lot of sense 2 Decembers ago when I read A Christmas Carol for very obvious reasons. It did not make as much sense last December when I read Nickleby. That was due in part to the novel itself and due in part to what annual authors is actually good for. And I'll be revisiting this little project of mine and reappraising it at the end of this video. So Nickleby and luck and coincidences. There are so many coincidences here that one of the characters actually remarks on it, I guess to preempt reader criticism. Tim Lincolnwater says, "Why, I don't believe now that there's such a place in all the world for coincidences as London is." Now, it's pretty plausible that a bustling metropolis like London, Victorian London, would have a population high enough and dense enough for characters to run into complete strangers who will become really significant in their lives. But whether that works out in terms of plotting is something I'd like to look at more closely. One example of a really crazy coincidence is when Nicholas meets Sir Mulberry Hawk for the first time. Now, Nicholas has been in Portsmouth, earning his living as an actor and playwright, and his mother and sister Kate have been in London. While they've been separated, Sir Mulberry Hawk has been harassing Kate really badly. And it has come to the point where Kate fears that he is not going to stop at just inserting himself in social settings to make rude and risque comments and make her uncomfortable in front of other people and, make her look like a woman who doesn't deserve respect. She doesn't think he'll stop there, but will actually go through with harming her physically. And she asks for help, but unfortunately does not receive it from their uncle. However, a friend of the family's decides he will intervene, and he writes to Nicholas and says, "You have to come home. Your sister is in trouble." Nicholas comes back immediately, but he does not hear the full story immediately. In fact, he doesn't know exactly why he has been summoned back to London. And it is while he is at a loss and in the dark that he takes a walk. And he's just pretty much walking aimlessly. In fact, Dickens says he is rambling when he stops in front of a hotel. And Dickens says he stops mechanically. And then he decides he wants to go in, even though it's not a hotel he can really afford, because he is strongly attracted to it, thanks to some odd mixture of feelings which he would have been troubled to define. And when he enters the hotel, he happens to be seated in the same dining room as Sir Mulberry Hawk. And Sir Mulberry happens to be talking about Kate and his nefarious plans for her. And he happens to use Kate's full name. and Nicholas happens to overhear. And that leads to a confrontation in which Nicholas is able to stand up for his sister as any good brother would do. And it's a very gratifying part of the plot for everyone who has been infuriated with Sir Mulberry up to this point. But yes, it came about because of a coincidence. A second very similar coincidence involves Frank Cheerable and a registrar office clerk who is a very, very minor character. What happens is the clerk and Frank Cheerable are in the same place, which is an inn. And it's not surprising that Frank should be there because he has just arrived from the continent and probably needed a place to stay before going to his actual lodgings or his actual home with his uncles. But what is a registrar office clerk doing there in the same place? It's not explained. He's just there because the plot needs him to be there, and he is also speaking disrespectfully of a woman whom Frank happens to know, and Frank stands up for the woman and gives this registrar office clerk a thrashing. When other people in the inn try to come to the clerk's defense, Nicholas, who has heard the story, stands up to defend Frank so that, a mob doesn't get to him. And that's how they meet, and that's how they become friends. And it's a nice introduction to Frank. We see him doing something very chivalrous. And we see that he's a stand-up guy, like our main protagonist. But it's a wild coincidence that someone from a whole different part of the story should happen to show up there and be talking about a very specific woman whom Frank knows, and Frank would recognize the woman from the description given by this guy. Now, these two coincidences, as I said, are pretty wild, but we accept them because they do something else, which is they give our characters a chance to exercise virtue, to prove their mettle, to show what they're made of, and also to give some villains a good thrashing, which, as I said, is pretty gratifying to the reader. But there is one coincidence which I really can't defend, and that is what happens to the character of Madeline Bray. Now, Madeline, when she is introduced, has such a hard, difficult, tragic backstory that it could have been a Dickens novel in its own right. We learn that her mother has died, and her father, who is very irresponsible and in general a horrible person, has thrown them into poverty because of his bad debts. And while they're running from his creditors, they have to live in small, drab, dingy rooms. And then her father also becomes ill and can't work as if he would work even if he were not ill. So Madeline has to support them both by being a governess to small bratty children, by drawing, doing needlepoint, and selling what she can, which would not really fetch a very high price, and basically just dealing with a man who has no remorse for what he has done to his own life and to his daughter's life, and who feels entitled to her hard work and her suffering, and who gets angry, and it's hinted even violent, when she doesn't do what he wants exactly how and when he wants it. Now, Madeline has been given an out. It's said that friends of her family, or rather relatives on her mother's side, have told her that they will take her in and care for her and be kind to her, but they're not going to take in her father because he's pretty awful. He was awful to her mother when she was alive, and he's awful now. And she basically says, thank you, but no, I have to stay with my father. I have to take care of him. Basically, she is an open faucet that just keeps pouring in, and he is a wide open gutter that keeps draining out. In short, he is one of the most two-dimensionally villainous fathers, and she is one of the most two-dimensionally virtuous daughters. And this lack of dimension is actually pretty important. So this is her situation when we meet her, and as if that weren't bad enough, Dickens takes it up a notch, several notches, actually. One of her father's creditors sees her and decides he wants her to be his wife. The problem is Madeline is a teenager and he is pretty elderly. And he is as ugly as he is old and as greedy as he is ugly. You know, even Dickens is disgusted by this guy. Let's give him his name, Arthur Gride, or Arthur Greed. It probably is Arthur Greed. Madeline is obviously devastated by her father's decision and disgusted by the prospective bridegroom, but she's still willing to go through with it. She is consenting to it. In fact, she even says, I do this of my own free will. She says it while sobbing. How much free will is actually there? But she's still willing to go through with it, even though there are friends who are ready to help her at that moment. She refuses to be saved without her consent, and she is withholding consent because she doesn't want to do anything which will hurt her father. So here the plot is inexorably driving her to a point where she will have to make a different decision. This is not like going out and finding honest work that just happens to be, you know, a life of drudgery and toil where you have to work your fingers to the bone. It's not that. It's something much worse. Dare I say, he's pimping his daughter out. And although filial piety is a great virtue, casting pearls before swine is not. And she is being brought to a point where she really does have to decide, will I be an accessory to my own degradation and abuse, so much more than I've already been? And just when we are at the tensest possible point, because it is the wedding day and Arthur Greed is there, ready to walk Madeline to church where she will plight her troth to him before she forever holds her peace. No, she does not get to speak, because at that moment her father drops down dead. It's as perfect as the timing was ever going to get. And while it frees Madeline from a horrible marriage, it also frees her, and not in a good way, from the chance to be a moral agent. This would have been her chance to do what Nicholas and Frank did earlier and show what she's made of. Stand up for herself. Do something to save her own life. Do something to change the course of her life, because until then she has just been reacting. All her actions have been, circumscribed by the life she happened to be living, or circumscribed by other people's decisions. This was her chance to make a really big decision, and it was just taken away from her by the narrative. I'm not happy about that. It is frustrating to me as a reader. It bothers me on another level as a woman. It is, not a really good way to resolve this conflict. And to add further insult to it, she becomes even more passive than she has already been, because when she learns that her father has died, she swoons, she faints and does not revive immediately, and Nicholas has to carry her out of there and into his family's home. And then when she does revive from the faint, she becomes very, very ill and has to be nursed by Kate. So either in bondage or in freedom, she's pretty much the same two-dimensional character. And as I said, this bothers me a little more as a woman, because I think the main reason Dickens made her father, vanish from the consequences as he did, is that he was writing Madeline to be the perfect woman, the perfect young woman, beautiful inside and out. And if she had stood up for herself and rebelled against her father, when anyone in the world, probably including Dickens himself, would have said she was in the right, it would also have made her less perfect in his eyes, and he didn't want to do that. This is a pretty small part of the novel, and yet it's making up the bulk of this video. I did find it very frustrating. Good luck and coincidences might not be the best sort of plotting, but they don't have to be bad storytelling if we see the characters rising to the occasion and really taking advantage of these opportunities that land in their laps. And we saw that in the examples I gave for Nicholas and Frank, and we see it in many other points of the story. But Nicholas Nickleby, in its mix of coincidence, which the characters have no control over, and consequence, which arises from their own actions, comes down really hard on coincidence. There's another character who remarks that Nicholas is the luckiest person in the world. And again, it's probably Dickens preempting more criticism from the readers. He's admitting, I know my character's lucky, and the villain is complaining about it, so let's all just be happy that he's lucky. And in Nicholas's case, because as we've seen, he uses these lucky opportunities to show that he has strong virtue, that he's a man of good moral character. And because he actually does suffer and do a lot of work in other parts of the novel, we can say that the good luck is just him reaping where he has not sown. He did the work elsewhere and then got the reward in another quarter. So it's easy for us to accept. And it's still, because of that, a fun novel to read. And frankly, Dickens is such a master of prose that even when the plot was getting really predictable and certain scenes had no conflict in them at all, the writing was still absorbing. Yeah, it's really fun to read. But will I do another Dickens in December at the end of this year? Probably not. If I do, I'll be reading the Christmas books because they're seasonal. They really are Dickens in December. But I won't be reading another Dickens novel just for the sake of finally getting to another Dickens novel. And I think my annual authors project, like Austen and August, is best for rereads. And actually, all the Austen novels are rereads for me at this point and have been for some time. But I have not been through so much Dickens. Nicholas Nickleby was a new read. The next Dickens novel will probably be another new read. And I realized I have to read these in other reading projects or as part of other reading challenges or games, and not as an annual author thing. So, in summary, Nickleby was fun to read and great to finally get to. I've been wanting to read it ever since I read Roald Dahl's Matilda and realized she had read something I hadn't. So there you go. I don't have to feel bad about that anymore. And it was a generally positive experience. I like going through the classics, and it was great to tick this off my bookish bucket list at last, but it's not going to be one of my favorite Dickens novels. If you have your own thoughts on Nicholas Nickleby, on coincidence and good luck in plotting, or anything else, please let me know. I'd love to read your comments.